This is what's left of my childhood desk, but I am determined that as many good things are going to come out of this as possible. I've already made a little side table for my parents' house, and now I need to make something or a multiple of things out of this that's not going to be a complete waste of time and energy. Because let's be honest, a lot of this would end up being burnt or chucked away. But I think I've got a couple of ideas, and in this video, I'm going to make a few items that I think you guys are going to like and you might be able to make yourself. I've got the 4 remaining chunky legs, but where some of them have still got 2 grooves cut in them, there's one that's got 3, rendering it almost useless. And then there's another one that's, well, they're just in a terrible state, let's just say that. I do have the veneered plywood, which I have got a plan for, because only one side of it's nice, because only one side's veneered, but it is only about 12mm thick, so I'm going to go back to back on that, laminate it together, so then I've got some plywood that is veneered on both sides, and I'm going to make something super simple out of that, if it goes to plan. So this was the top and part of the sides of the original desk. It's a little scratch, but that can't be helped. I'm just going to apply a good amount of glue. And as when I cut the strips off the desk, the pieces became a little warped, I'm also going to clamp both pieces to one of my failed attempts at a table saw fence. I knew it would be handy one day. But what about the rest of the scraps? What can we do with that? The rest of it, well, I guess you're going to have to watch the video to see if that turns into anything as well. I think whenever you see these projects, one thing that's important is knowing how long it's taken to get from one stage to the other. So far, I've spent an hour and a half, 90 minutes, prepping the wood. And I have to say, it is in a worse state than I expected it to be. I've spent a decent amount of time shimming out the gaps, and it's not necessarily because that's the bit you're going to see. It's more because it gives you a bit of stability when you're working it, sending it through the table saw or using other tools on it. All I've done is used a hand plane to get the shims down to the right width for the rebates that I'm filling, and then I've filled them in. There's also a couple of open mortises that I need to fill in as well. That's done exactly the same way, just hammering a block of wood in with a bit of glue and making sure it's a tight fit. You saw me laminate the 2 bits of veneered ply together. I'm going to give that another hour or so to cure before I start working on it. And then I had a look around and took stock of what I've got left. Take the legs for one project, take the veneered plywood for another. The rest is all solid sapele. I've got an idea, it may not work, but we're going to push through and see what happens. But from here on out, I'm going to separate it into 3 projects. Veneered plywood project, table leg project, and scraps project. So first up, let's do the veneered plywood, mainly because I think that's going to be easier. We're going to be using the 2 veneered plies that we've laminated together. What we've been left with here is about 1 inch thick, which is probably a bit too much for what we need. I've also done a little bit of art, a little bit of geometry, and I've come up with this. This is a hexagon. And yeah, don't look too closely because it didn't go right. What I know is it's got 6 sides, and the angles, I believe, should be 120. I think if it's like the pen pots we did in another video, I need to set my table saw at 30 degrees. And I need to make a jig. So this is the jig we made for the pen pots. This is basically Wobie Design's jig. So what you do is you lay your first piece here, table saw set at 30, you cut the one end there, then you lay it into this bit, and then you cut the next bit. But this is basically what I'm drawing inspiration from for this jig. And for any jig, you have to choose between 2 options, in my opinion. 1, is it going to run along the fence? 2, is it going to have a runner? The benefit of having it on a runner like this is the fence moves right out the way, and if you're putting an unwieldy bit of stock on like this, you're not going to worry about it banging into the fence because you can clear everything out of your way. So I'm going to go with the runner. To create a 0 clearance, we're going to shave off the edge here at 30 degrees. So when our piece is hanging over it, it's going to support the fibres on the back. So order of operations is this. Turn the blade, pop this in the runner, pop your board on top in the right place. A couple of dabs of CA glue will hold this in place, and then take it all away, screw it down, and then when you run it through the blade, as I say, you get that 0 clearance. And then we put battens on the top, and that's really as easy as a jig needs to be. Now, the most important thing to remember when lining up the battens is to ensure that they're 90 degrees to the 0 clearance cut we just made. The lowest batten is to make the initial angled cut, so the second one needs to be at least the width of the board you're cutting above the first. And I don't trust just CA glue here, so I'm just going to screw these in place as well. The last batten we're going to place at 90 degrees to the top one, as it dictates the outside length of the finished piece. And that's it. But before I can test the jig, I need to clean up both sides of the boards that were laminated together. And also I cut a rebate along the length of each of the pieces. This rebate is just to house the backboard. Now I decided to film the testing of this jig, and it's lucky I did, as I didn't actually turn the camera on for the actual job itself. But don't worry, the procedure is exactly the same, and I will show you the finished product both times. So the first thing you do is you place the board with the rebate closest to you against the bottom batten, and make the first cut with the blade set to 30 on your table saw dial, which will read 60 degrees on any digital gauge that you have. Once you've done the first cut, rotate the board so that the angled cut you just made is against the length batten. And then with the board snug against both battens, you can make your cut, like so. And this gives you your first piece. Mark it so you can keep your grain match, and then go again. Now, to ensure you lose as little of that precious grain as possible and it lines up as best possible, when making the second piece, carefully line up the angled cut to the 0 clearance cut batten. Then make your next cut. Then it's just rinse and repeat until you have all 6 pieces cut and marked. And to glue up the hexagon, it's just like any mitered box. Lay the boards flat, use blue tape across the back, and that will tighten as the joint comes together. And if everything was cut right, the last joint should be absolutely spot on. And then when I was happy with this, I cut the actual pieces off the veneered ply that I'd laminated earlier. And as I said, I forgot to film it. But you can see that the results and the taping and the gluing is exactly the same as we did on the test piece. And if I'm honest with you here, the ply could have probably done with being 18mm thick overall rather than the 24 that I've got here, or the full inch. It does feel a little bit clunky at this stage, but with these types of builds, you genuinely can only work with what you've got. It's worth mentioning here that you could easily save a lot of frustration by skipping the reclaimed wood and just buying some straight for the job. But for me, the frustration is actually part of the challenge here, so I embrace it. In a way, it's a necessary evil, let's say. But you know what isn't a necessary evil? Spam calls. Hundreds of constant interruptions to your piece at home. I won't tolerate that, and if you won't either, then you need Incogni. For me, it started with just a few calls, but then the emails started until I was getting 15 to 20 a day. That's when I did some research. And it turns out that online data brokers have been selling our personal information to businesses and marketing agencies, and this causes the calls and emails. Personally, I find the calls not only intrusive, but downright rude. There is a solution you can do yourself, but it requires contacting hundreds of these data brokers individually and requesting that each one removes your information from their system. If that sounds like a lot, then that's where Incogni comes in. Pick a plan like the Friends and Family plan, one that covers you and 4 other family members. Sign up and let Incogni reach out to the brokers to request your information is removed, and then the calls will stop. I had my data scrubbed because of the calls. They're a nuisance, but it can be worse. Your information can easily be used to have your identity stolen, an identity that can be used to open a bank account or take out a loan. So take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code START at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. And thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring today's video. Now, the reason I cut 2 different sizes of hexagon here is to show you how versatile this actually is and how easy you could actually make this into a box rather than a shelf. You see, the hexagon that's cut with the rebate is going to be a backer board, but the smaller one that I actually cut to the size of the front of this hexagon could be attached to any lid you want to use to make this into a box. And just know you can adjust the jig to whatever size you like, small box, large box, small wall mounted shelf or a large wall mounted shelf. You decide. And well, I guess LifeMark needs to decide too. Let's find out. This, as you've noticed, I'm sure is going to be the shelf version of what I want to make. And I've taken this back panel, I've painted it in a nice matte grey. If you're going to do this, make sure there's some room on the edges for glue, and that will just pop into the back. Before you make any other decisions, if you're working with something like this, take a look at the veneer and see if there's any damage on it. If, like me, there's a bit of tear out and you found that some of the corners have rounded over with the veneer taken off, get some of these marker pens and give it a quick touch up. And take a look at what you've done and see if you like it. I know that sounds a little daft, but there's a couple of things not to like about this if it's your taste. Exposed plywood, very simple. You can veneer that if you want to. And then the actual veneer that's already on there. You may remember that table I made for my parents out of the same veneer. It didn't look great until I dyed it. So I'm going to very carefully use this one as a test because I've made 2. And if it wrecks this one, I won't do it to the next one. Let's finish it off and see what it looks like. Now, this is the favourite stain from everything I've tried over the years. It's easy to apply and it goes off really fast. And I think it looks natural, but it makes enough difference to be noticed. But here are the side-by-sides, you decide. And we're very nearly done. I'm really happy with how these are turning out. I'm just going to countersink in a little bit of keyhole hardware so that you can put your screw in and then drop it into place. And then, bit of finish. I really should have applied the finish before gluing the back panel in place, but it's too late now. I'm using this hard wax oil from Handicraft. I always pop a link to this in the description. It is so easy to apply. You rub it on, buff it off, and for any low traffic area, this is my current go-to finish. It is so easy, and the end result is lovely. And so this is the first completed item, or items technically. And it's just my opinion, but I think these have come out lovely. And with the jig, you can now make as many as you want. You can have them standing alone, or you can mount them together to give you a honeycomb type of effect. I don't think 2 is quite enough for that, but 3, 5, 7, any odd number really I think would look really aesthetically pleasing. And then once they're on the wall, You can use them to display your most treasured items. And now possibly the most risky project that I'm going to try. I've got a lot of randomly sized sapele pieces left over, and they all seem to be roughly the same width, which in the moment Mark thinks is a really good thing. It's not, but he won't know that for a little while yet. So here's the plan. Assuming the width is the same, which it isn't, I decided to cut all the pieces to the same thickness. And then I should be left with identical dimension battens. Should be. It is a little annoying that I can't get this done with the crown guard on the saw, but the gripper push block does help. And once they're all cut, I'm going to line up 5 together and cut them at just random lengths. You'll see what I'm trying to do pretty soon. I'm also going to mark each piece so I can keep them in order. And once my pieces are cut, I can cut some more, making sure they're all still in the same order, and then repeat the whole process again. This is going to leave you with 2 pairs or groups of 5 battens. All slightly uneven in length and no set lengths here, just improvise, have fun with it. Next, each set of 5 gets glued and then clamped together. And this is the first time that I realised I should have taken a little bit more care on dimensioning each batten. Where I said ish earlier, knowing that they weren't perfectly the exact same width, well, that all means they're not all perfectly square on the sides that I've not cut. Still, LiveMark doesn't know the issues yet. Once the glue's set, I can join the pieces together with 3 more unevenly lengthed battens to create 2 square-based things. Sorry to get all technical with the lingo. Now there's a clue to future problems here. You can see how many clamps that are needed to glue up not square battens. What could go wrong? LiveMark? So I took these out of clamps, and apart from a few glue joints that haven't exactly set how I want them to, the rest of it just looks a bit crap. First of all, if you're going to do this, make sure your battens are perfectly square. Mine aren't. I could sand it all flush, I could make it pretty, or I could risk ruining it completely. He still thinks that it isn't pretty well ruined, but there may still be a fix. Here's the original idea, a lamp made up of 2 of these, one floating over the other, held together by acrylic bars, strong and hopefully invisible-ish. And in the moment, I decided to push on with this idea a little bit further. I drilled 3 holes for the acrylic, leaving one corner open to add to the floating effect. The holes were as straight as I could get them, so, not very straight, but the pieces still came together okay. Not perfect, but okay. And actually now looking at it about a week after the build, I'm not convinced that this actually isn't the best this could possibly look with a bit of cleanup. But in the moment, I'd already decided to risk it and have a bit of fun. So out came the die grinder. And I'm going to spare you a lot of the carving footage as the sun was way too bright for a wood carving with a wooden table background. Just know that the cut saw bits do the damage, and then this cone sander does most of the cleanup. And each piece had to go back into clamps a total of 4 times per piece, as the joints were not aligned, not strong, and generally badly made. So they didn't hold up very well. But with a lot of glue and perseverance and a little bit of swearing, I can show you what I ended up with. I didn't sand out every scratch as I wanted a rough but refined kind of look. In truth, I didn't think it would ever stay glued together. But here you can see what it looks like with a light inside. It's not perfect. It'll probably never sit on a bedside table in my house, never be used as a lamp, but hopefully it might inspire some of you guys to see what you can do with your scrap wood and have a little bit of an experiment. Because I've lost nothing but a few scraps and a bit of time, and I still had fun. And now, here's a bonus build. You see, the lamp didn't use up nearly enough of the scrap wood. Making small projects like this, the wood does actually go a long way. So rather than making the battens square that have already caused me a problem, I threw caution to the wind again and just marked one side on all of them. My theory here is that I could keep each of the battens aligned. This is a really simple build. You just got to have 3 different lengths of batten cut. I decided just to mark these 3 lengths out on the top of my table saw with a pencil, as accuracy is not necessary. Then using the mitre gauge and some tape to stop the smaller blocks falling into the saw, I just cut a random amount of all the different sizes. No plan, just cutting until I figured I had enough. Spoiler, 72 blocks for this is enough. Then I arranged them and rearranged them a number of times until I was happy with the fact that they were randomly laid out. Well, randomly if you count the very careful and specific way that I laid them out, so no 2-ish were next to each other. Anyway, before gluing them to the scrap veneer ply backer board that I had, I sanded each side and slightly rounded the top. And yes, there was 288 sides to sand in total, not to mention 72 end grain tops. Now if I'd have sanded prior to cutting the 288 sides, that would have only been 40 sides to sand. But let's not dwell on that. And when you're laying out these pieces, they can be as ordered as you want or as scattered as you like. I leant slightly closer to the latter on that due to losing sight of the sides that were slightly different dimensions because the battens were not square. I did line each line of cubes up so that there was an even spacing on each of the edges. And then CA glue and a bit of spray of activator made this process really quick. And as it's only a decoration, the strength is going to hold just fine. And you could easily make this type of thing as big or as small as you like. Not to mention cutting the blocks to as big or as small as you like too. One could be a simple and small picture frame size wall art, another one could cover the entire wall. But if I did make this with larger blocks, I would definitely have left more overlap at the sides to hide the plywood's side grain. But these touch-up pens did a great job, and I'm going to leave a link to them below, although they may just be marker pens in disguise. But I do like having a range of shades. And here my finish was actually chosen for me because there were some tiny specks of CA glue on the end grain, so I went for a lacquer rather than a wax finish. And that's it. The little scrap wood from the scrap wood project. A little bit of art, put it on your wall, or a really kamikaze coaster if you don't mind spilling most of your drinks. I will say I think lacquer was a good choice to finish, but the way I've done the lacquer is not perfect. I'm going to go over with a little bit of a light sand on the bits I can get to, and then do a very light spray over. But for scrap, that's not bad. Oh, this one may be one step too far with scrap wood. I've done my best to trim off all the areas where I put the inlays in, and I mean, you can see from there without a close-up that I can't use that as a show face. However, I have marked on every single piece 2 faces that are pretty acceptable. And I'm going to give the build a shot still, but I think the sheer fact that none of these are perfectly square, none of them have got perfectly flat edges because, well, they all had a bit of a twist in them from being the legs of a table, means it's going to be really hard to do what I want. And what I want is to make a picture frame. I always say lean into the rugged on this, and this is going to be about as rugged as we're leaning into the rugged. So it's a simple job to make any picture frame. What you need is a rebate on every single piece to hold the glass and the picture and the backboard. And then on top of that, you're going to need to mitre everything to a perfect 45 to join them together to make a rectangle. Dimensions wise, well, I like to stick to the golden ratio. 1.61 times the height makes the width. That's a nice pleasing shape, but if it goes wrong, I'll have to keep trimming. So to make the rebate, you've got a couple of ways here. You can use a router or you can use your table saw. It depends on how you feel comfortable. From the table saw point of view, the danger is that you can't really do it because it's not a full through cut with the crown guard on, so you lose dust extraction and a bit of safety. With the router, you're going to cause a lot of mess and you're going to have to take a lot of passes on it. So, all things considered, I'm going to give it a shot on the table saw because it also gives me repeatability. And I'm also going to be using the same table saw with my Hongdui mitre gauge to get the perfect 45-degree angles. Now, the easiest way I can do this without building a full mitre sled for the saw is to actually see the frame as 2 sets of pairs, the sides and the top and the bottom. So what I do is I cut one to the right length out of each of the pairs, and then on the second one I sneak up to an identical fit. First cut gets it to around 3mm short, and then I shave small amounts off until I have them absolutely identical. Then glue up is just like we did with the hexagon shelf before. And yes, cutting the rebate does leave you with some more scraps to use, but that's going to be for another video. Let's jump to life mark while the glue cures. So the frame went together really well. I did a chamfer on the inside just because I think that brings the light in nicely. And the most important thing is getting the 45-degree cuts right. If you get that, you're pretty good to go. Clamping wise, the blue tape will hold the corners on the outside, but I had this in a ratchet clamp originally and it wasn't quite squeezing it right, so then I put my own clamps on the top and now I've just left my own clamps. One thing to note, if you clamp too hard one way with the 45-degree angle, you're pushing this piece out, so you kind of have to adjust everything, squeeze it tight all together bit by bit. This stays in overnight, and then after that, for an added bit of strength, I'm going to put some splines in, and I'm going to use a method that I saw in Lincoln Street Woodworks where he just runs it up to his table saw with a stop block, and that creates a 45-degree cut, albeit with a curve in it, but you never see that. And then a spline fits in there nicely. That adds a load more strength because it's long grain to long grain instead of end grain to end grain. And then after the splines are in there, I'm just going to take a hand plane to it, give it a good sand, and then we're done. So this is the finished picture frame right here. And I'm going to be very honest with you. I mentioned a minute ago that the golden ratio is what I use for picture frames. Don't be me here. Find out the regular size of the picture you want to put in it and make the picture frame to those dimensions, because this is a lot wider than it needs to be for the height that it is. As for the wood itself, well, when I planed the surface to get a nice finish, I did come through to one of the filled mortises. What I will say is, it happened to be one that I did a good job on, or it was already done 50 years ago by the guy that made the desk. That's probably more likely. I cut some acrylic on the table saw, I made a backer board out of ply, and I just got some hanging hardware from Amazon. I'll leave some links below, but you can get it from anywhere. And one last truth as well. The way I glued this up wasn't perfect. And in all honesty, the splines are holding this together more than the glue on the end grain. If I could give you one bit of advice whenever doing a job like this, water down a little bit of glue. While the miters are open and you've got the blue tape in place, just put it on the end grain, let it soak in, because that will seal the end grain. I glued these straight, clamped them up, and yes, they fell apart 3 or 4 times before I got the splines in place. If you want the process to be a little bit easier, that glue in the end grain will give you a stronger bond on the mitre, and then the splines will finish the job. But overall, not a bad picture frame. And a little bit of information that you may not need. This will be going next to the side table that I made from the same desk in the same house with my parents. I thought that was a nice touch. And so here's our haul. This is everything we've made out of the scrap wood from the desk, and I think we've done all right. Oh yeah, and we've got a jig. Should we need to make any more of these hexagonal shapes, boxes, shelves, for anything else? I'm not advising people that you should go and start ripping apart furniture that you still want. What I am saying is there's a lot you can do with your scraps and old recycled furniture. It would be remiss of me not to warn you that it will, as you saw in this video, take a lot more work than if you just bought the wood for the project, but it gives you that opportunity to experiment. Try something different. They're not all winners, but the next one might be. Overall, I really hope that you've enjoyed the video. I've certainly enjoyed making it, and I've got a ton of scrap wood left from the desk still. So there'll probably be another one. If you like these sorts of videos, I'll pop a couple up there that I think you'll like. If you subscribe, there's a load more on the channel. And if you click on these, well, I'll see you over there. Thanks a lot.